The first time I thought someone might be trying to push me out of the company was when I received a negative performance review that simply made no sense. I remember that day perfectly because, up until that moment, I was convinced my career was going better than ever. I had spent 5 years working at that company. I knew many of our most important clients. I had a good relationship with most of my co-workers, and I had just finished one of the most profitable projects of the entire quarter. For months I had been working on that account almost every single day, coordinating meetings, solving problems, and making sure the client was satisfied with every stage of the process. When we finally completed the project, several executives congratulated the team publicly, and some co-workers even told me they thought I was close to getting promoted. That was why, a few weeks later, when I sat across from my director during my annual review and listened to a list of criticisms that seemed to describe a completely different person, I didn't even know how to respond. If you enjoy stories about workplace betrayal, abuse of power, and people eventually facing the consequences of their own decisions, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Valeria, and for a long time I believed I had found a place where I could build my entire career. I joined the company shortly after graduating from college, and from the very beginning I took the job seriously. I didn't have powerful connections, family members inside the organization, or anyone opening doors for me. Everything I achieved came from years of work, late nights, and a habit of accepting responsibilities that often weren't even part of my job description. There were periods when I stayed in the office long after everyone else had left because a project needed extra attention, and there were weekends when I worked from home just to make sure deadlines were met. Nobody forced me to do those things. I did them because I wanted to grow. Over time, I gained experience, learned how to manage difficult clients, and gradually became one of the most trusted people in the department. For years, my relationship with Patricia, the department director, was perfectly professional. We weren't friends, but I always felt that she respected my work. My annual evaluations were positive. Clients regularly left good feedback, and whenever an important project appeared, my name was usually one of the first to be considered. That was exactly why I was so surprised when Daniela arrived. The first time I heard about her was during a weekly meeting when Patricia casually mentioned that her niece had recently graduated from college and was looking for professional experience. Nobody paid much attention to the announcement. In many companies, it isn't unusual for someone to recommend a family member or a friend for an open position, and as long as the person performs well, it rarely becomes a problem. In fact, several employees at her company had originally been hired through recommendations. When Daniela joined a few weeks later, my first impression was positive. She seemed polite, friendly, and genuinely interested in learning. Since I had been with the company for years and understood many of our internal processes, Patricia asked me to help Daniela during her first few weeks. I agreed without hesitation. For nearly 2 months, I spent a significant amount of time helping her adjust. I explained procedures, shared documents that could make her job easier, and answered countless questions as she learned how everything worked. There were even days when I spent more time helping Daniela solve problems than focusing on my own projects. I didn't mind because I remembered exactly how overwhelming a new workplace can feel. Daniela appeared grateful for the help, and our relationship was friendly. The first signs that something was changing were so small that I barely noticed them. It started with meetings where Patricia insisted on having Daniela present even when she didn't really have a role in the project. Then came comments where Patricia constantly praised her niece for things that were fairly ordinary for someone in her position. None of it seemed particularly alarming. In fact, if someone had asked me at the time whether favoritism existed, I probably would have said no. I assumed Patricia was simply proud to see her niece adapting to the workplace. However, as the weeks passed, I began noticing something strange. While Daniela received more and more positive attention, I started receiving criticism for things that had never been an issue before. At first, they were minor observations about formatting details in reports. Then came comments about my attitude during meetings where nothing unusual had happened. Later, there were questions about decisions I had been making successfully for years without anyone objecting. None of those criticisms were serious on their own, but their frequency began increasing in a way that was impossible to ignore. At first, I thought maybe I was simply going through a rough patch. Everyone makes mistakes and nobody performs perfectly forever. However, the more I reviewed my work, the less sense the situation made. Projects were still being completed successfully, clients remained satisfied, and the department's results showed no signs of problems connected to my performance. Yet Patricia seemed increasingly interested in finding flaws where she had once seen strengths. One day, during a meeting with one of our most important clients, something happened that especially caught my attention. We had spent several weeks preparing a proposal, and a large portion of the work had passed through my hands. When it came time to present it, Patricia insisted that Daniela play a major role in the presentation. I had no problem sharing responsibilities, but I was surprised when, after the meeting ended, Patricia publicly praised Daniela for ideas that weren't even hers. At the time, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was probably being too sensitive and moved on. But when similar situations began happening over and over again, I started wondering whether I was imagining things at all. The answer arrived a few months later during the performance review I mentioned at the beginning. As Patricia spoke about supposed attitude problems, lack of initiative, and difficulties working with certain team members, I felt like she was describing someone else entirely. What made it even stranger was that many of the examples she used came from projects that had produced objectively positive results. When the meeting finally ended, I asked for specific examples so I could better understand what needed improvement. Patricia responded vaguely, avoided going into detail, and concluded by saying she expected to see significant changes over the coming months. I left her office confused. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like something was happening behind the scenes and I wasn't seeing the full picture. Over the following days, I tried to focus only on my work, but the more I paid attention to what was happening around me, the more strange details I noticed. Daniela was becoming involved in projects that normally would have been assigned to me. Patricia seemed to include her in important discussions where I had traditionally been present, and several co-workers started making comments that suggested something inside the department was changing. What I didn't know yet was that the negative performance review wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was the first step in a much larger plan that had already been developing for months, a plan that would eventually cost me far more than a promotion. Because only a few weeks later, I accidentally overheard a conversation that made me realize my position inside the company was in far more danger than I had ever imagined. During the weeks that followed that performance review, I tried convincing myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. After 5 years at the company, I didn't want to become one of those people who blamed others every time they received criticism. I reviewed my work repeatedly, asked a few trusted coworkers for feedback, and tried to identify whether I was actually making mistakes that I hadn't noticed. However, the more I analyzed the situation, the harder it became to find a logical explanation. Clients were still satisfied, projects continued moving forward successfully, and my results were practically identical to what they had been for years. The only thing that seemed to have changed was the way Patricia viewed everything I did. The conversation that finally made me suspicious happened completely by accident. One afternoon, I stayed later than usual finishing reports for an important client. Most employees had already gone home, and the office was nearly empty. While heading toward the printer, I passed a conference room with the door slightly open. I wasn't trying to listen to anything, and I actually kept walking until I heard my name. Instinctively, I stopped. I recognized Patricia's voice immediately, and also the voice of one of the HR managers. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough to leave me deeply unsettled. They were discussing a possible departmental restructuring, upcoming changes within the team, and the need to prepare a smooth transition. What really caught my attention was hearing Patricia mention that Daniela was learning quickly and would soon be ready to take on much greater responsibilities. I immediately continued walking because I didn't want anyone to think I was eavesdropping, but that conversation stayed in my head for days. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe they were discussing future promotions or long-term planning. Even so, something about it didn't feel right. Until then, I had always been the person who took on larger responsibilities whenever important opportunities appeared. Now it sounded like someone was preparing another person for that role. Shortly afterward, changes began happening that made it much harder to ignore my concerns. Projects that normally would have been assigned to me started going directly to Daniela. The strange part was that Patricia would later ask me to help Daniela whenever those projects encountered problems. In other words, Daniela was being presented as the person in charge while I continued solving many of the difficult issues behind the scenes. At first I tried viewing it as part of her learning process, but the same pattern repeated itself so many times that I eventually began wondering what was really happening. At the same time, the criticism directed at me continued increasing. Every meeting with Patricia seemed to include a new concern. Sometimes she questioned my communication skills. Other times she suggested I wasn't adapting well enough to changes within the department. Occasionally she claimed I needed to become more collaborative with certain team members. The frustrating part was that none of these criticisms came with clear examples or specific situations. Everything was vague, subjective, and difficult to challenge. I started feeling as though I was being judged by standards that changed whenever it was convenient. The situation gradually began affecting my confidence. For years I had felt secure in my professional abilities because my results consistently supported my work. Now I found myself second-guessing decisions that I would normally have made without hesitation. I reread emails multiple times before sending them, analyzed every comment made during meetings, and constantly worried about making mistakes that could later be used against me. Looking back, I think that was one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. It wasn't just the fear of losing my job. It was the feeling that someone was slowly trying to convince me I wasn't as capable as I had always believed. Some of my co-workers also started noticing that something unusual was happening. Nobody openly discussed it because Patricia held a lot of influence within the company, but during private conversations several people admitted that Daniela seemed to be receiving very different treatment from everyone else. Mistakes that would have immediately generated criticism for another employee were ignored when she made them. Opportunities that normally required years of experience were being handed to her within months. Even so, most people preferred staying out of it. Nobody wanted to become involved in a conflict with the department director. The real warning sign came when one of my oldest clients called me directly to ask whether I was leaving the company. I remember that conversation clearly because it completely caught me off guard. When I asked why he thought that, he explained that he had received several emails where Daniela was listed as the primary contact for issues that had always gone through me. The most concerning part was that nobody had informed me about any such change. I tried remaining calm during the call, but as soon as it ended I went looking for answers. Patricia's response only made me more concerned. According to her, she was simply redistributing responsibilities to improve departmental efficiency, and there was no reason to interpret the situation negatively. However, she repeatedly avoided answering one simple question. If this was merely a temporary adjustment of responsibilities, why had nobody informed me beforehand? Every time I asked, she redirected the conversation towards something else. Over the next several days, I began paying much closer attention to everything happening around me. That was when I discovered something that completely changed my perspective. While reviewing internal documentation connected to various projects, I found records showing that Daniela was gradually being added to virtually all of my major accounts. Not one or two. All of them. Clients I had managed for years were slowly being transferred to her. Some transitions had already begun. Others were scheduled for the coming months. That night I took notes home and sat down to review everything carefully. The more I analyzed the information, the more obvious it became that this didn't look like a normal reorganization. It felt as though someone was trying to duplicate my entire role, my client portfolio and my responsibilities through another person. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility that they were preparing to replace me. Even then, I still didn't have enough proof to reach a definitive conclusion. There were alternative explanations, and I wanted to believe one of them was correct. After all, I had devoted 5 years of my life to that company. I didn't want to accept that the department director might actually be building a case against me in order to benefit a family member. The answer finally arrived a week later during a meeting with Human Resources that was supposedly intended to discuss my professional development plan. I walked into the room expecting a conversation about future goals, training opportunities, or possible career advancement. Instead, I found Patricia and 2 HR representatives sitting across from me with unusually serious expressions. The moment the meeting began, I realized something was terribly wrong. Because for the first time, someone openly mentioned the possibility of placing me on a formal performance improvement process, using a collection of alleged problems that had somehow never appeared during my previous 5 years at the company. And when I saw the documents they had prepared, I understood that this had been planned for a very long time. The moment I saw those documents spread across the table, I understood that the meeting had nothing to do with my professional development. For a few seconds I tried convincing myself that there had to be some misunderstanding, but that hope disappeared quickly. Patricia began talking about concerns regarding my performance, issues with adaptability, difficulties collaborating with certain team members, and an alleged decline in the quality of my work. As I listened, I felt a mixture of disbelief and frustration because many of the situations she referenced had either happened completely differently or had never happened at all. What worried me most was that everything had been documented. Reports, internal comments, and recent evaluations had been collected to create a version of me that looked nothing like reality. I responded to every point as calmly as I could. I explained the context behind several projects, presented measurable results, and highlighted obvious inconsistencies in some of the claims. The HR representatives listened politely, took notes, and thanked me for the additional information, but I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing I said was going to change the outcome. It felt as though the decision had already been made long before I walked into that room. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. My work suddenly came under a level of scrutiny I had never experienced before. Emails that used to be approved within minutes were reviewed repeatedly. Routine meetings turned into lengthy discussions about insignificant details. Every minor mistake was documented, and every success was minimized. At the same time, Daniela continued receiving more responsibilities, more visibility, and greater access to important clients. I remember one particular meeting with one of my largest accounts. I had worked with that client for years, and our professional relationship had always been strong. Yet this time, Patricia insisted that Daniela take the lead during most of the presentation. The result was disastrous. Important information was presented incorrectly, several questions went unanswered, and the meeting ended far less successfully than usual. Even so, when everything was over, Patricia publicly praised Daniela for her effort and later sent me an email highlighting areas where she believed I needed improvement. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was a coincidence. As the months passed, a few co-workers began quietly sharing information that confirmed my suspicions. Several people had heard discussions about a future restructuring of the department. Others had seen planning documents where Daniela appeared connected to responsibilities that had historically belonged to me. One co-worker even admitted that Patricia had been introducing Daniela to senior leadership as a future star within the company. Little by little, the picture became impossible to ignore. They weren't evaluating my performance. They were preparing my replacement. The official news arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was called into another meeting with human resources. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. I was informed that the company had decided to terminate my employment due to performance concerns and a lack of alignment with the organization's future objectives. I remember hearing those words and feeling a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was because I had spent months watching this outcome approach. Maybe it was because deep down I already knew the decision had very little to do with my actual work. I packed my things that same day. Some co-workers avoided eye contact because they felt uncomfortable. Others quietly approached me to say goodbye and wish me luck. As I walked toward the exit carrying a cardboard box, I noticed Daniela sitting at one of the nearby desks. She didn't look proud. She didn't look happy. If anything, she looked nervous. For a brief moment I considered saying something to her, but I kept walking. It no longer mattered. The months that followed were difficult. Losing a job always creates uncertainty, and for a while I questioned many things. However, something unexpected happened. The professional relationships I had spent years building remained intact. Several clients stayed in contact with me, and multiple former colleagues recommended me for new opportunities. Thanks to those connections, I found a new position much faster than I had expected. The salary was better, the working conditions were better, and for the first time in a long while I felt genuinely appreciated for the effort I put into my work. Meanwhile, news about my former company started reaching me little by little. At first I heard that several important clients were becoming dissatisfied. Then I learned that a few contracts had been lost. Later I found out that experienced employees had started leaving the company altogether. Initially I assumed these were normal challenges that any business could face, but the problems kept growing. About 6 months after my termination, I received a phone call from a former coworker. What he told me was both surprising and deeply satisfying. According to him, several major clients had left the company following a series of mistakes and management failures. Many of those clients were connected to the very accounts that had been transferred to Daniela. The worst part was that the problems could no longer be hidden. Financial results were beginning to reflect significant losses, and senior leadership was demanding answers. As internal investigations expanded, details started emerging that Patricia had managed to conceal for quite some time. It turned out she had repeatedly used her position to favor her niece while ignoring internal procedures and standards that applied to everyone else. It also became clear that some of the reports used to justify personnel decisions contained questionable evaluations and highly biased conclusions. Suddenly, people who had accepted her version of events without question began asking uncomfortable questions. The situation finally exploded when several major clients formally raised concerns with executive leadership. At that point, it was no longer about rumors or personal conflicts. There were measurable financial losses. There were cancelled contracts. There were declining results that could not be ignored. Attention inevitably shifted toward Patricia and the decisions she had made over the previous years. I don't know exactly what conversations took place behind closed executive doors, but I do know the outcome. Less than a year after I was fired, Patricia was gone. Officially, it was described as a voluntary departure, but almost everyone understood what that really meant. Daniela didn't remain much longer either. Without her aunt's constant protection, it quickly became obvious that she wasn't prepared to handle many of the responsibilities she had been given. The most ironic part of the story came several months later. One of my former clients, someone I had worked with for years, contacted me regarding a major opportunity through my new company. During our conversation, he mentioned something I will never forget. He told me that when I was fired, many clients were shocked because they considered me one of the most competent people they had ever worked with. In other words, while Patricia had spent months convincing people internally that my performance was inadequate, the clients who actually knew my work had reached the exact opposite conclusion. That conversation helped me understand something that had taken a long time to accept. When I was fired, I felt like I had lost something important. Looking back now, the opposite was true. They were the ones who lost. They lost experience, trusted relationships, and someone who had genuinely contributed to the success of the business. I was simply forced to find a better place. Today, when I think about everything that happened, I no longer feel anger. What I feel is relief. Because if Patricia had never tried to replace me with her niece, I probably would have spent years in a company where merit mattered less than favoritism. And while walking out of that building carrying a cardboard box felt like a defeat at the time, it ultimately became one of the best things that ever happened to my career. People often think winning means holding on to what you already have. But sometimes the greatest victory comes from losing something that was preventing you from moving forward. And while Patricia ultimately lost her position, her reputation, and the trust she had spent years building, I gained a better career, a better environment, and the satisfaction of knowing that I never needed family connections to earn my success.